Stephen Douglas Hopper was born on July 29, 1831, in Morgan County, Illinois. He was the first of 11 children born to Cavil and Polly, or Poppy, Spencer Hopper. When Stephen was born, his father was 23 and his mother was 17. Stephen grew up in Greene County, Illinois, where his father worked as, you guessed it, a farmer, and his mother worked as a housewife. In 1850, Stephen was 19 years old and working on his family farm with his father. 3 years later, in 1853, Stephen's mother, Polly, filed for a divorce from her husband, Cavil, the charge being adultery. Cavil responded that the charges were untrue and that she was not entitled to the divorce. Despite Cavil's plea, the judge awarded Polly the divorce. I'm no lawyer, but after reading the list Polly walked away with, I did feel she got quite a good deal after the divorce. In the divorce record, the judge ordered Polly was to receive the wheats, oats, hay, corn, potatoes, and fruit grown on the place during the present year, 2 cows and calves, 19 head of sheep and their wool, hogs for pork for the family for another year, 1 horse and wagon, all household and kitchen furniture, 2 plows, 1/3 of the land, including the homestead, and custody of the 7 youngest children. Cavil received visiting rights with his children as long as he behaved in a proper manner. On the exact same day the divorce was granted, Cavil sold the remaining land he owned. 4 years later, on May 9, 1857, when Stephen was 25, he married 18-year-old Sarah Jane Florence. Stephen and Sarah lived in Greene County, Illinois with Stephen's father, Cavil. Stephen and Cavil were farming together while Sarah worked as a housewife. Stephen and Sarah would have 7 children together, 4 boys and 3 girls. Their names were Harriet, James, John, Henrietta, Jasper, Albert, and Mary. Sarah would have their children from the age of 20 until the age of 31. On September 2, 1862, when Stephen was 31, he left to serve in the Civil War for the Union. He was a private in Company F, the 101st Infantry for Illinois. During his service, Stephen was in Sherman's March to the Sea. This destructive military campaign lasted from November 15th to December 21st in 1864. General William Sherman marched 60,000 soldiers 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. The troops supposedly didn't destroy towns, but if anyone tried to fight back, their homes and barns were burned and livestock and food stolen. General Sherman wanted to prove to Confederate followers that their government could not protect them from an invading army, and he wanted to frighten them into abandoning the Confederate cause. I can only imagine the horrible things Stephen saw and what he had to do during this march. At some point in the war, Stephen was wounded in battle and he was hospitalized in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Stephen served in the war until 1865. When Stephen mustered out, he was in Bladensburg, Maryland, so he had a long journey home. After serving in the war, Stephen returned to Sarah in Illinois and they would have 3 more children together, with their last child being born in 1869. 2 years later, in 1871, Stephen and Sarah decided to get a divorce. A family story I read on his Family Search profile stated that after they had split up, Stephen took off with the children and he was headed for Missouri. Apparently he didn't make it very far and he was caught by the sheriff, and the children were returned to their mother. After the divorce, Sarah remained in Illinois. The next year, she married Tillman Patterson. They would have 3 children and would stay married the rest of their lives. After being caught by the sheriff, Stephen still ended up traveling to Ozark County, Missouri, where he settled in and met his next wife. Stephen's children all stayed in Illinois and lived with Sarah and Tillman. On February 2, 1885, when Stephen was 53, he married 42-year-old Susan Cash. Susan had never been married, and she had 2 sons as a teenager out of wedlock. Susan and Stephen did not have any children together, and the couple would only be married for 6 years due to Stephen passing away. Stephen passed away on May 29, 1891, at the age of 59. After Stephen passed away, Susan followed him 11 years later. Susan passed away on May 20th, 1902. I wasn't able to find a death certificate for Stephen or Susan. Stephen is buried at the County Line Cemetery in Ozark County, Missouri, next to his wife, Susan. I also cleaned Susan's grave, and her video has already been posted. According to Find a Grave, Stephen's father, Cavil Hopper, is also buried at the County Line Cemetery. Cavil outlived Stephen by 4 years, passing away in 1895 in his late 80s. Cavil has no headstone in the cemetery, but he has an in memory of stone in Richwood Cemetery in Greene County, Illinois. Stephen's stone has 2 hands and a handshake carved at the top of his stone. This is a symbol meaning farewell with the hope of meeting again in the afterlife. Here are the before and after pictures of his stone. I took the after shot 3 months after the first cleaning. If you can see those little black spots all over his stone, I'm not really sure what those are. I come across them quite often here in Missouri on older stones. They seem to be like a deep surface staining under the rock because scrubbing does no good at getting them out. So in a year, if I can get back into the cemetery, I will respray his headstone with D2, and we just have to be patient. The D2 will eventually get his stone clean. I did still go on his Find a Grave page, and I did upload my cleaned photo to it anyways, and hopefully in a year I can go back and get a better shot then. Joseph Decker was born on November 28, 1870 in Pulaski County, Kentucky. He was the 6th of 9 children born to James and Cassandra or Cassie Mink Decker. When Joseph was born, his father was 36 and his mother was 32. Joseph grew up in Pulaski County, Kentucky, where his father worked as a farmer and his mother worked as a housewife. Around 1885 or 1886, Joseph's older brother Jonathan Decker decided to move west to Missouri. Joseph was a teenager at this point, and together with his parents and 6 of his siblings, they moved with him. They traveled by wagon and settled in Ozark County, Missouri, south of Dora. Not long after the move, his brother Jonathan bought a store in a small community called Birdtown. Jonathan would later build a bigger store there in 1917. The store was built so the nearby spring ran underneath it. That store Jonathan built over 100 years ago is still standing today. After moving and living in Missouri for almost 20 years, Joseph met his wife. On April 30th, 1904, when Joseph was 33, he married 19-year-old Laura Collins. Joseph and Laura lived in Ozark County, Missouri. They owned their own house and farmed for a living. Joseph and Laura didn't have any children, but in the 1920 census, the couple had a 14-year-old boy living with them named Leslie Bennett. Leslie was attending school and farming with Joseph. His relationship to them was listed as a boarder. In Laura's obituary many years later, Leslie was listed in the family as her foster son. On the afternoon of November 13, 1939, Joseph Decker loaded up into the back of a pickup truck headed for the nearby town of West Plains, Missouri. Joseph lived in the country and not everybody owned a car. Back then, it was normal for many people to ride together to town to get supplies or for entertainment purposes like visiting the movies. Also traveling in the pickup were 8 other people, whose ages ranged from 19 to 61 years old. At 4 p.m., the truck was traveling on 14 Highway when it skidded in loose gravel and overturned. After the accident, a physician from Colorado Springs named Dr. E.P. Hummel just happened to be driving by. He stopped and brought the most seriously injured to the neighboring hospital. Joseph survived the accident, but passed away due to his injuries shortly after making it to the hospital. The newspaper stated, Mr. Decker's skull was crushed at the base of the brain, 1 shoulder broken, some ribs, and 1 ankle broken. His death certificate stated his cause of death was a brain injury due to his fractured skull. Everyone else in the pickup survived the accident with injuries. Joseph was buried in the County Line Cemetery in Ozark County, Missouri, next to his sister, Amanda, or Mandy Decker, and his parents, James and Cassie. I also cleaned James and Cassie's graves. James' video has been posted, and Cassie's will be posted soon. After Joseph passed away, Laura eventually moved to West Plains in Howell County, Missouri. Laura lived 37 years after Joseph passed away, and she never remarried. Laura passed away on August 4th, 1976, at the age of 92. Laura is buried in Parsons Cemetery in Ozark County, Missouri, with her parents and siblings. The county line cemetery was abandoned after 1940 when the road to it was shut down. Joseph was one of the last few burials to happen in that cemetery. Sadly, Laura didn't have the option to be buried next to her husband. Her stone is also incomplete. Laura probably had her stone put in before her death, which isn't uncommon. Her stone has her birthday on it, but after she passed away, nobody made sure her death date was added, and it is still blank. Joseph's stone has flowers and a dove carved at the top. The dove represents love, purity, and innocence. His epitaph reads, "At rest." Here are the before and after photos of his stone. I took the after shot 3 months after I did the first cleaning on it. When I first saw the stone, I saw all the black underneath it. It was just really hard for the camera to pick it up. And then you probably noticed after I sprayed it with the D2, it really came to life and it showed all that staining that was underneath the stone. That staining is like ingrained in the stone and scrubbing on it won't help. So I'm just going to leave it alone and let the D2 eventually clean it over time. I plan on going back to this cemetery in the springtime when the flowers are blooming, and I'm going to recheck all the stones in there and update their photos again if need be. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. In this video, I cleaned a grave for 2 infant sisters named Mary and Lydia Matthews. Lydia was born first on January 17, 1889, in Ozark County, Missouri. She was the 7th of 15 children born to Phineas and Alice Ewing Matthews. Lydia was named after her grandmother, Lydia Roush Matthews, Phineas's mother. When Lydia was born, her father was 46 and her mother was 26. Before Lydia was born, Phineas served in the Civil War for the Union when he was only 19. After serving, he began farming, then married Alice Ewing, and they started their family together. The couple lived in Hancock County, Illinois, then moved to Ozark County, Missouri, sometime before 1889 when Lydia was born. After the move, they remained in Ozark County and farmed for a living. Out of their 15 children, including Lydia and Mary, 4 would pass away at a young age. 11 out of 15 children surviving to adulthood is impressive for that time period. Lydia was the first baby they lost. She passed away on August 21st, 1889, when she was only 7 months old. 9 months after Lydia passed away, Alice gave birth to another daughter, she named Mary. Phineas and Alice both had sisters named Mary, so they were probably her namesake. Mary Matthews was born and passed away on May 26, 1890. In the Matthews family Bible, they recorded Mary's birth and death but hadn't named her. They listed her name as infant, just like they did the twins. They must have changed their minds, though, and decided to name her. Mary was buried next to her sister Lydia, and the girls share a beautiful double headstone together. 13 years after Mary and Lydia passed, on December 15, 1903, Alice gave birth to twins. One baby passed away on December 27th at 12 days old, and the other twin passed away the next day on December 28th at 13 days old. I can't imagine a more awful way to spend Christmas and New Year's losing your babies like that. There is no record of what gender the twins were, and they are simply recorded as infant twins in the Matthews family Bible. The twins are buried together a little down the row from Mary and Lydia. Their stone says twins, gone but not forgotten. On March 24th, 1916, at the age of 73, Phineas passed away due to ascites. Ascites is abnormal fluid accumulation in the abdomen. Phineas and Alice had been married for 37 years when he passed. The family buried Phineas in the County Line Cemetery next to Lydia and Mary. After Phineas passed away, Alice and her 3 children still living at home moved to Twin Falls County, Idaho to live with her son James. Alice lived with James until her death 18 years later. Alice passed away on July 13, 1935, at the age of 72. Alice's obituary stated she had been battling an illness since January of that year, but it didn't state what the illness was. She is buried in Twin Falls Cemetery in Twin Falls County, Idaho. Lydia and Mary are buried at the County Line Cemetery in Ozark County, Missouri. This is the abandoned cemetery that I helped clean up. Mary and Lydia are buried next to their father Phineas, their grandparents, William and Angeline Macomber, and their infant twin siblings. The Macombers donated the land the children are buried on to be used as a cemetery, and they are Alice's mother and stepfather. I also cleaned their graves and Phineas's. Phineas and Angeline's videos have already been posted, and William's will be posted soon. The twins' headstone wasn't very dirty, so I sprayed it with D2 to keep it looking that way. Unfortunately, you may have noticed Lydia's name is spelled wrong on her stone as Lida. I know it's spelled wrong because her name was recorded as Lydia in the Matthews Family Bible. It's not uncommon to find spelling errors on old stones. Many people that lived in this area in that time period didn't know how to read or write. Another stone spelled wrong in this cemetery belongs to 1-year-old Eleanor Epps, whose stone sadly says Elnior. Mary and Lydia's stone has 2 doves carved at the top of it. Doves are the most common symbol found on children's graves and represent love, purity, and innocence. Mary and Lydia's very long epitaph was not readable before I cleaned their stone. Their epitaph says exactly, "Our loved ones has gone and left, a region of sorrow and pain, to the glorious land of bliss where they shall never suffer again. Farewell, our loved ones, farewell." Here are the before and after photos of Mary and Lydia's stone. It cleaned up really well. I couldn't read any of it before cleaning it. You can see here that Lydia's name is misspelled as Lida. I did go ahead and upload their clean photo to their Find a Grave page. I also typed in what their long epitaph says. That way, if their headstone becomes dirty again, we'll always know what was wrote there for those babies over 100 years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Hello everyone. In this video, I cleaned the grave of a 2-year-old little girl named Virgia May Cropper. Virgia is a child that is buried in the abandoned cemetery called the County Line that I have helped clean up in this video series. When I went to research her, I wasn't anticipating finding very much information on her just because she was a child and she was forgotten. The amount of information I found on her family was overwhelming, and I just want to say this is probably one of the most interesting stories I've ever told. Her father was quite the character. He was arrested several times. He was a murderer. He assaulted his neighbor. He was a famous moonshiner. The list goes on. With that being said, I'm excited to tell you guys this story, and I just think it's so neat how you can find out this much history and information just by looking up the family story on a 2-year-old. So enough of me rambling, let's get into the story. Virgia May Cropper was born on January 11th, 1914 in Ozark County, Missouri. She was the 4th of 7 children born to James, or Jim, and Cora Eldridge Cropper. When Virgia was born, her father was 30 and her mother was 24. Since there isn't much information on Virgia herself, I'm going to tell her parents' story. On January 27, 1906, Jim Cropper and Cora Eldridge had their first child together, a daughter named Hazel. Cora was 16 and James was 22 when their first child was born. A little over 2 months later, on April 2, 1906, Jim and Cora eloped to Mountain Home, Arkansas, and were married. The newspaper article reporting the marriage said, "No wonder Jim came back all smiles." Jim and Cora would have 7 children together total, 3 boys and 4 girls. Hazel, Henry, Claude, Virgia, Woodrow, Jewel, and Thelma. Cora worked as a housewife, and Jim said he farmed for a living, but he was also a moonshiner. 10 years after the couple were married, Jim had his first run-in with the law. In May of 1916, early in the morning, Robert or Bob Maynard harnessed his mule and had started plowing a field. Bob was Jim's neighbor and their farms bordered each other. After working for a while, Bob stopped at a spring and was leaning over getting a drink of water when Jim ambushed him from the back with a .30-30 rifle. The first shot fired hit Bob in the shoulder and lodged in his back. Bob then began to run away, and Jim fired 4 more shots at him. 3 shots missed, and 1 slightly wounded his cheek. Bob managed to escape to his home and alerted the law. Jim was arrested when the empty rifle shells were found near the scene of the shooting, and it was said Jim had the only rifle in the area that shot those type of shells. Jim confessed to the shooting and was put under arrest in the Gainesville, Missouri jailhouse. The newspaper reported that Bob had been giving too much attention to Jim's wife Cora, and Bob had even written her several letters. This made Jim jealous, who decided to end it all by shooting Bob. During his jailhouse interview, Jim said he wished he had taken better aim and finished the job. The newspaper said his trial awaited on the outcome of Bob's wounds. Bob survived the attack, and the paper never reported on any trial, so I'm guessing Jim was released since he wasn't successful in ending Bob's life. Only 1 month after this incident occurred, Virgia passed away. Virgia passed away on June 26, 1916, at the age of only 2. Virgia's cause of death was enterocolitis. Enterocolitis is inflammation that occurs in the intestines, colon, or stomach. It's caused by bacteria, viruses, or parasitic infections. The main treatment for this is antibiotics, which weren't invented in 1916 when Virgia became sick. Virgia was laid to rest in the County Line Cemetery in Ozark County, Missouri. Virgia's great-grandparents, James and Cassie Decker, are her only relatives that I found buried in the same cemetery. They aren't buried near each other for some reason. Virgia was the only child Jim and Cora would lose at a young age. 4 years after Virgia passed away in 1920, the family had moved to Craighead County, Arkansas. 2 years later, in 1922, Cora passed away at the age of only 32. There is very little information about her death. Her exact date of death and cause of death are unknown. It is documented she passed away somewhere in Arkansas, but where she is buried is also unknown. I did find that Cora gave birth to her last child, Thelma, in January of 1922, which to me is a hint her death may have been caused by a complication of childbirth. 1 year after Cora passed away, Jim had remarried and had another child with his new wife. Sometime after Cora's passing, Jim married Oma Strong. Oma had one child out of wedlock at 16 before meeting Jim, and she was 21 years younger than him. In July of 1923, they had their first child together, a daughter named Pauline. Oma was 18 and Jim was 40 when Pauline was born. They would also have 2 more sons together, Ray and J.R. Cropper. 3 years later, Jim and Oma had moved back to Ozark County, Missouri. In January of 1926, Jim was arrested for making moonshine and exhibiting a deadly weapon in a threatening manner. 2 months later, in March of 1926, Jim and his 16-year-old son, Henry, were arrested. They were caught building a fire under a moonshine boiler near their home. When they heard the officers coming, they fled and hid in a nearby cave. The officers, of course, cornered them in the cave, and they surrendered. The moonshine still was destroyed, and they were taken to jail. The judge set their bond at $2,000, which is equivalent to about $35,000 in today's money. Jim, of course, didn't have the money, and they were locked up. 3 months later, in July of 1926, a trial was held for Jim and Henry on their moonshine manufacturing charges. Jim was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Henry, who was only 16, was discharged. Prohibition was in full swing during this time. The government had prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. This obviously explains why Jim was released from jail after shooting and injuring his neighbor, but served a prison sentence for making alcohol. Jim served his prison sentence and was released 3 years later in March of 1929. After being released from prison, Jim was on good behavior for almost 6 months. On the morning of August 29, 1929, 20-year-old Orville Shipley and his family had been to visit his father. Orville was traveling home in a car with his wife Nancy, his 14-month-old son Merle, and his 2 brother-in-laws, Edgar and Edward Hurd. A gunshot suddenly rang out and hit Orville in the head and neck, killing him instantly. The attacker was firing on them with a shotgun loaded with No. 2 buckshot. The second shot was aimed at Edward Hurd, which hit him in the front of his head, leaving him in critical condition. Nancy and baby Merle were struck in the face by stray shot, which caused flesh wounds. During the assault, Edgar Hurd, who was the only one in the car not injured, said he saw Jim Cropper when he looked out from behind a tree after firing the first shot. The injured were taken back to Orville Shipley's parents' house, where medical help and the law were summoned. The law brought bloodhounds, and they were sent on the trail for Jim. The hounds were unsuccessful in finding Jim's trail, so deputies continued to hunt for him. 2 days later, Jim turned himself in to the sheriff at Gainesville. Jim's alibi story was he left his home early that morning to visit a friend named Alex Hicks. Alex had served a 2-year term in the state penitentiary for liquor law violations at the same time as Jim. Jim then said he went to the Barker sawmill to look for work. When they had none for him, he went to the Ewing Loftus farm where he spent the night. When he returned home the next morning, he said he found out he was wanted by the law and decided to turn himself in. So, why would Jim want Orville dead? It was later found out, 2 weeks before the ambush, Jim's son Henry had taken the Hurd brothers and Orville to their moonshine still and had gave them some liquor to drink. Jim met up with them during this time and a fight almost broke out. Jim accused Orville of stealing a moonshine still from him while he was serving time in the penitentiary. Orville denied this and said he traded a dog for the still. The next week, the sheriff found and seized the moonshine still the men had been shown. Jim later told neighbors he believed the Hurd boys and Shipley had tipped the sheriff off on the still location and also that they had stolen from Jim. The newspaper said, Jim Cropper has long been known as a dangerous man and a leader among Ozark County moonshiners. A few weeks later, while Jim was in jail awaiting trial, his son Henry was arrested for moonshining again. 3 months later, in December of 1929, a jury deliberated for 45 minutes and found Jim Cropper guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison and was sent back to the Missouri State Penitentiary. After his sentencing, Jim's wife Oma divorced him sometime in 1930. Oma would eventually remarry a widower named Willie Forrest. They had one son and were together until Willie's death in 1979. 2 weeks after Jim's trial ended, his son Henry, who was still awaiting his trial, escaped from jail. The sheriff had permitted Henry to go in and out of the jail to help with chores. Henry would bring in wood, tend the fires, and do other tasks. After the chores were done, the sheriff said he went to lock Henry up for the night, and he was gone. Henry was captured over a year later in Augusta, Arkansas. He was brought before a judge and sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary for moonshining and escaping jail. Henry was released from prison in 1933, and he continued to be in the paper for stealing. His stolen items included watermelons, car parts, and a generator. He married in 1935 and started a family. This seems to have settled him down, and he eventually moved to California. Jim lived a long time after his sentencing. I'm not sure if he served his entire life sentence, though. He was in the 1950 census, still in the Missouri State Penitentiary. There are no other records of him until he passed away in 1974 at the age of 91. His obituary stated he was living in Harrison, Arkansas at the time of his death, and he was buried in Pilgrim Rest Cemetery. According to Find a Grave, this cemetery is in Sunflower County, Mississippi. I'm not sure if this is correct, but there is a photo of his stone on there, so maybe it is. This whole story circles back to Virgia. It amazes me the stories I find from these old stones. I found all this information from researching a 2-year-old little girl who was buried over 100 years ago in what is now an abandoned cemetery. At the top of Virgia's stone is a dove with an olive branch in its mouth. This is a symbol of peace and harmony. Virgia's epitaph reads, "Sleep on, little daughter, and take thy rest. God took you home, he thought it best." Here are the before and after shots of Virgia's stone. As you can see, it has that black mold-like stuff just ingrained into the stone. I also found this type on Rachel Crane's grave, and I also found it on Stephen Douglas Hopper's grave. So I'm just going to have to let the D2 do all the work, and I'm going to recheck it this spring and respray it as needed. I hope you enjoyed that story. Thank you so much for listening.